Hey friends, it's Jacob. Something I wanted to talk to you about today is something that I struggle with a lot as an artist. It's something that I've always struggled with as an artist. And I'm sure that it's something that you can relate to as well if you're an artist or a creative of any sort. So, have you ever been out hiking or traveling somewhere or even just walking or driving around your neighborhood and then suddenly you see a scene that just pops out to you and you're like, I'm painting that. That is a scene right there. Sometimes it just happens that way. Scenes just jump right out at you. Well, that's what happened to me a few weeks ago on a big hike that I did with my family in the Enchantments in Washington. I came across this scene and I thought to myself, this is going to be a painting. I just knew in my bones that it was going to be a painting. And so, get home from the trip, go through my pictures, find this picture, which I was so excited to paint when I was physically there in person, seeing it with my eyes in the environment. And then, as soon as I look at the picture, I think, oh, I don't know if I can paint that. That looks really hard. That looks really complicated. I don't know if I can do that. And so I'll sit there and stare at it for a while, and I'll talk myself out of it, and I won't paint it, and I'll paint something that is easier. But this time, I decided to force myself to actually attempt to paint it, and this is the result. I have to say, I'm very happy with how this turned out, and we're going to get into exactly how I made this in just a second. But before we did that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about dealing with self-doubt as an artist and how difficult it can be to do and how much of a struggle it is. It happens all the time. It's not something that just pops up occasionally, despite the literal hundreds of paintings I've done that have turned out perfectly fine, even ones that I thought were going to be impossible to paint. They've turned out to be some of my best paintings ever, despite all of the evidence I have that I am a good painter and that I do know what I'm doing and that I am capable of painting really complex scenes and having them actually turn out not a mess. Despite all of that, sometimes I'll sit down and I'll pick a photo and I'll think, there's no way. there's there's just no way. I just get overwhelmed, you know. But luckily, I have a very how do you say it? English is not Englishing. What's the word? Let me start over. I'm on like 2.5 hours of sleep. So, can you see the dark circles under my eyes? What I'm trying to say is I have a system that I follow for basically every single painting, and it works the same for almost any scene that I want to paint. I have a series of steps that I follow for almost every single painting that I do. And so that gives me something to fall back on. It's an instinct, it's a muscle that I've grown. So I don't really have to think about what's happening when I'm actually painting the scene. I have to do a lot of thinking about it beforehand, and that's when I can run into problems of overthinking it. But taking such a complex scene like you see in this picture and simplifying it to such a degree that it makes a good painting like this pretty good can seem completely impossible when you're just looking at the photo, but it is possible, and it's not as hard as you think. And I'm telling myself this as much as you. Paint the painting you're afraid to paint. Just try it. Just jump in. Just force yourself to do it. Step a little outside of your comfort zone. with your painting, because that's where your growth as an artist is going to happen, and it's also where your growth as a human is going to happen. As they say, everything you want is just outside of your comfort zone, and that holds true for painting as well. So I'm going to break down my process in this video of the steps that I fall back on, the basic steps that I fall back on when I feel like a painting is too difficult. Now, sometimes a painting is going to be too difficult, and that's okay. Now you know where your limit is, but I bet more often than not, you'll surprise yourself with how well it actually turns out. So, that's enough rambling. Let's get into the painting.
So step one of my process is having a good reference photo to paint from. If you don't have a good reference photo, you're just not going to have a good painting. You really have to start with a good quality reference photo that is actually suitable for painting. And that in and of itself is a whole entire video topic. The next step is having a good sketch. You have to have a good sketch that accurately represents and portrays your scene. If you don't have a good sketch, it's going to be really hard to have a good painting over top of it. Next step is preparing the paper, which you just saw me do, wetting down both sides with a sponge so that it lays flat. And then the step after that is painting the first wash, which is all of the lightest values of the painting. Painting the color of the light itself. Usually that's going to include the sky and all of your highlights in areas that are being directly lit. So for this sky, it's a very interesting thing going on. It's overcast, but it's very bright. There's a lot of sun shining through those clouds. So I dropped in just a little bit of yellow ochre into the sky to give it that warm glow. And I'm painting all of this while the paper is still damp to give me those nice, soft, fuzzy shapes. Now I'm painting in that mountain in the background. I want it to be a very fuzzy blue shape. You'll notice that in the photo, that mountain that is very far in the background is almost the same, has almost the same tonal value as the objects in the foreground, and that's a problem for painting. We have to find ways to create more separation between these different planes in the scene. And to help do that, I've gone ahead and made that background mountain very fuzzy, very soft, and very blue. And that's going to push it back into the scene. I also glazed over those beautiful granite rocks with just the slightest hint of blue-gray, just to tone the rocks a little bit. Now I'm just dropping in the initial color of the grass, which is kind of an earthy green. I will end up painting over this grass again in the second wash to bring it down to middle value. You'll notice that the grass in the photo is significantly darker than the rocks around it. So I decided to include that in the middle value, but we don't have to worry about that until the second wash. This scene really stood out to me when I was walking past it because of the contrast between those bright white granite rocks and that dark green grass, and then the mountain peaks in the background, and the way the sky looks. Very dramatic, but also familiar and approachable. Not overly dramatic, if that makes sense. It seems grounded. One of the reasons I was so intimidated by this scene is because of how much is going on. It's very complex. There's a lot of different elements. And if I focus too much on just how many different elements there are, I will get overwhelmed and I will decide to paint something else. But something that really helps me get past this is painting big to small. So for example, in this first wash, it's literally as big as almost the entire scene itself. I'm painting these very big abstract blobs of color. I'm not really painting the individual shape of anything at this point. All I've done is paint around those rocks, really. So the first wash is about the biggest, most abstract shapes, and then every consecutive wash after that, we will tighten it up and add those smaller and smaller and smaller shapes as we go. I'm just drying my paper off with a blow dryer. You don't have to use a blow dryer, you can just let it dry on its own, but I am impatient sometimes and I want to get to the next part of the painting. Now we're going to begin the next step, which is the middle value. This is where we're going to really define the shapes of everything in the painting. So these trees is what I'm going to be starting with. I believe these are larch trees, if I'm not mistaken. And these trees have a very distinctive shape, so I'm spending a lot of time really getting the shape right. That's another thing that helps me when I'm feeling overwhelmed by painting, is to force myself to paint slower, to slow down, take my time with it, to not be in a big rush to just get it done. And my goal with middle value is to connect everything in the scene that is middle value into one big shape if it's possible. So I'm painting all these different shapes and letting them physically touch each other and flow into each other across the entire scene. Those trees that are a little farther back in the scene, I'm making them slightly bluer and just a tiny bit more washed out. There's a little tiny bit more water in the mix. And this is another way to create different planes within the scene. The problem with painting from photos, I would say one of the biggest problems with it, is the photo tends to compress everything and make the scene look very, very flat. You really lose a lot of the sense of depth. But you can recapture that in the painting with using tricks like this, by making more distant objects slightly bluer and less detailed and more washed out. Having lower contrast in the more distant objects and higher contrast in the objects that are closer to the viewer will help exaggerate that sense of depth that you just lose in the photo. So that's something you really have to be conscious of when you're painting from a photo. We're not trying to copy the photo exactly as it is. We're creating a painting. We're not reproducing a photo. It's called a reference photo for a reason. It's there for reference only. And we can do whatever we want with it. So now I'm dropping in the shadows on these rocks, which is kind of a neutral gray, slightly warmer on this end of the painting, and then in other areas I will make it very slightly more blue, more cool, and I'll kind of just vary back and forth between those. And you'll notice here also these shadows, I'm connecting all of these shadows into one continuous shape. And those shadows will be connected into the grass and into the shapes of the trees eventually. So just taking my time, going nice and slow. I really want to accurately capture the shape of these shadows. There's a lot of very interesting movement happening in this scene, and a lot of beautiful contrast between the highlights and the shadows. I also like the sense of scale and the kind of fractal effect you get with the bigger rocks that break down into smaller rocks, that break down into smaller rocks, and then you've got the pebbles scattered across the surface of the grass. It's all the same rock, but it's taking all of these different forms, which is really the same form, just repeated over and over again and getting smaller every time. The form is the same, but the scale changes. And the shape that these smaller rocks take, these rocks that you could just climb up on top of, are the exact same shapes that the giant mountains in the background take, because they're all made of the same kind of granite. I just think that's so interesting. So we're essentially staring right here at a very miniature version of that mountain in the background, but it's the exact same processes happening to create these shapes because it's made of the same material, and they're experiencing the exact same kind of weathering from rain and freezing and thawing and wind and all of that. And so you can kind of see now that big middle value shape coming together, and you can start to make out the individual objects that that shape is creating. You can see the individual boulders, you can see the trees, you can see the shadows the boulders are casting on the ground. This is all just one tone, it's just middle value. That's all it is. And that's all I'm concerned about at this point. Now I'm just going to glaze over that grass with a much richer mixture of green. There's a lot more pigment in this mixture because I really needed to bring that down to middle value to help the white of those rocks pop out more. And you'll see that effect happen as I paint the grass in. It's really satisfying. And I'll leave a few areas of the grass to where you can see the lighter green shining through. Just give it some highlights here and there. And for this mixture of green, I've got cadmium yellow, cobalt blue, and there's also a little bit of burnt sienna in there, which is kind of a rusty, earthy red color. I find that helps make a more earthy, toned down green. And there's also some areas in the grass where you can see the soil underneath showing through. So it's useful for portraying that effect as well, having that reddish color in there. And you can see that I'm painting around those rocks in the foreground, because I really want those to be kind of an anchoring feature at the bottom of the scene. Having objects like that in the very foreground that stick up over the edge of the frame is very useful for anchoring your scene and for giving it a sense of scale and perspective. We call it breaking the edge of the frame, and that's a technique that painters and photographers use. So you really can see now how darkening that grass made the rocks pop out a lot more. Now I'm going to start painting in those larches on the left-hand side. And something to keep in mind when you're working with green is to add a little bit of color into the mix every now and then. Add some blue here, add a little more yellow there, throw some red in there occasionally. Just vary the mixture up. You don't want it to be this homogeneous green that looks exactly the same everywhere. That'll make it look stiff and unnatural. So I like to kind of drop in the shape of the trunk and then paint the branches and everything else around that. It helps me keep track of exactly which tree I'm painting, and it helps me paint the branches in a more accurate, realistic way, physically connecting them all to the trunk. And I will go back in later with some dark and darken up that trunk a little bit and some of the branches, but I like to get that initial shape in there and get it right the first time. Now I'm going to paint in the trunk of this tree that's right in the middle, top middle of the frame. It's kind of a reddish brown. This tree has a lot of interesting things going on. It's a very interesting shape against that bright sky. I like the way the branches kind of reach up into the sky like that. I'm going to come back later and finish painting that tree, but for now I'm going to drop in the shadows on that rock in the foreground. And we'll add some of the details on the branches of this tree here. Being very careful with how I'm painting this because I want to accurately capture what this tree is doing because it's right in the middle of the frame. The trees to the left and right, I want it to be accurate as well, but I really want to spend my time with this one and take it slow. Darkening up that trunk a little bit with some burnt umber. Painting in some of those individual branches. And that will just about do it for the middle value, or the second wash. Now we're going to move on to the next step, which is the darks, or the third wash. There's a lot of areas in the trees that I need to darken up, the shadows in the trees. The cast shadows on the ground from the rocks are going to be dark. And I will end up darkening the shadow parts of the rocks as well, just a little bit. So I'm going to mix up some dark colors on my palette for these trees. Essentially, I just mixed a very dark mixture of gray using some cobalt blue and burnt umber, and then mixed that right into the green that's already on the palette to get that rich, dark, greenish color. You could also just drop straight dark gray onto the trees and it would look fine. I do that quite often, actually. And I'm using a smaller brush now, because remember how we're working big to small? Well, now is the time for the smaller details. So, big shapes, big brush, little shapes, little brush is the rule of thumb. And this is really where the scene is going to all come together, is in this stage. Adding these darks is going to give us that sense of three-dimensionality and form. And darkening all of the objects in the foreground while leaving the objects in the background faded and washed out like that is going to make that sense of depth really pop. So something that really helps me not get carried away with the darks because you don't want to kill all of your light, is when I'm looking at the reference photo, I like to squint my eyes so that it gets fuzzy. And that helps me see the areas of dark as more abstract shapes. Try not to paint the thing itself. What I mean is, if you're painting a tree, don't think to yourself, oh, I'm painting a tree, I'm painting a tree, I'm painting a tree. Just focus on what the shape looks like. Don't try to name what it is. Just focus on what the shape looks like and what the shape is doing and how that shape connects to the other shapes around it. Try to see things more in terms of form and shape instead of the actual object itself. So darkening up this foliage here at the base of this rock is going to help pop out those highlights on the rock even more and ground that rock, no pun intended, into the scene. Make it look like it's going to make it look like that rock is stuck into the earth, that it's a part of the earth, if that makes sense, by painting these dark shapes at the base of it. Just adding some texture into the ground there. Very sparingly. I also loved how there's these little tiny miniature larch trees poking up behind some of these rocks. I just think it's so funny how they look exactly like full-grown trees. They have the exact same shape, but they're teeny tiny little trees. It just, going back to fractals, that sense of scale that you get in this photo is really cool, and I wanted to take the time to portray that. Darkening up the cast shadows from those rocks laying on the ground. And you see how as I'm working in this area, the shape of everything just kind of comes alive. And you can start to make out individual pebbles and rocks. This wash is all about bringing out the individual shapes in a more precise way. So with each consecutive wash, you get a little bit more precise every time with what you're doing. So it's like you're saving all of the fine detail for the very end of the painting. Most of the time. Usually that's how it works. Darkening up those background trees just a tiny bit. And you'll notice if you look at those background trees, see how much less detail there is in those trees compared to the ones in the foreground. This rock had a stain on it, probably from water falling down it for thousands and thousands of years. And I thought that was such a cool detail, so I wanted to portray that. I just used some burnt sienna and some burnt umber. Just drop that shape right in there. And here I'm darkening up the shadow edges of these rocks just a little bit. Not quite all the way down to the dark, but slightly darker than the rest of the middle value. I would still consider this middle value, but just a slightly darker middle value. And this is also helping me get some more texture in the shadow side of these rocks. You see how that made the highlights on the rocks just pop out even more? I'm just adding some texture to the highlights on the rocks, giving it that rough granity look. Such an interesting looking landscape. I'm just painting in the cracks in these rocks. I thought that was a really cool feature. Just a really small detail that sells the fact that these are rocks. You got these little spiderweb cracks in them. Pushing the darks just a little more in some of this foliage. I felt like it needed just a little more three-dimensionality. Painting in some of those smaller trees right next to these taller larch trees, helping with that sense of scale. I'm just adding a few final details here and there. We're just about done. And that is a finished painting. I'm really glad that I forced myself to paint this, even though, honestly, I was very intimidated by it. I'm very happy with how it turned out. And I encourage you to paint the thing that you're afraid of, and I bet you'll surprise yourself with how well it turns out. And if it doesn't turn out, you learn something. So, either way, you win. I really hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I'll see you on the next one.